This love does not pick and choose. Look at what he says if we look back to our text in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 45. He says, so that you may be sons of your Father. The motivation behind it. So we can be sons, beloved children. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Not even the tax collectors do the same, don't they? You see, God's love does not pick and choose. It's not a, well, if you love me, I'll love you. Isn't the type of love that we have today? We love things today. We love people today because they provide something to us. That's a selfish love. That's not God's love. God's love says, I don't pick and choose who I love everybody. You see, this love that he's talking about in Matthew chapter 5 is not a lovey, touchy-feely type of love. This is not a, man, God's asking me to invite my neighbors over to my house and to love on them and to send them valentines and flowers. That's not what he's talking about. That's not the love that he's saying here. I read it this way. It's not an emotion, but rather an action of decision. It's not an emotion. He's not talking about an emotional type of love. He's talking about this action. How do you see people? Maybe that's a good question to ask. How do we see people? Do we see people as annoying? Do we see people as unbearable? Or do we see people as souls? Do we see people as somebody that Christ also died for? Does that not change how we look at people? It should. See, this love is an action. It's causing me to make a decision on how I'm going to react. It's a love that says I'm going to act in the best interest of my enemies. What does that best interest look like? What is our number one motivation, church? To point people to who? Christ. That's our number one motivation. That is the best interest of people. Am I right? That is the number one thing we're to point people to. How can I be somebody who hates my enemies and also point people to Christ? You can't. You cannot do that. Christ had this feeling. He's dying on the cross, blood flowing from almost every part of his body. He's hurting. He's in pain. And you know what he does? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. In that moment, in all of that pain, he was looking out for the best interest of those people. He was looking out not for himself. But we look at this idea, this love, that's not something that picks and chooses. It's a love that's, listen to me very closely, it's a love that's unmotivated by our actions. It's a love that God has for us whether we love him or not. Right? Isn't that what Romans 5 says? It's a love that's unmotivated by our actions for him. He doesn't say, okay, if you go to church, 50% of the time I'm going to love you. If you give this much money in our little clear boxes in the foyer, I'm going to love you. He doesn't say, if you walk so many older ladies across the street, then I'll love you. He also doesn't say, if you never sin again, then I'll love you. He understood how unrealistic that was, so what did he do? While we were yet sinners, he sent his son. I want you to open up in your Bibles to Romans chapter 5. I want you to see this for yourself. Because if we're thinking about this love that doesn't pick and choose, that we're to love that way, we're not loving those who only vote like us, who only act like us, who only give us things, who only love us back, but our love is for their best interest. Romans chapter 5 and verse 6, for while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Verse 7, for one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since, therefore, we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. For while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son. Much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. Look at that verse 10 again. Maybe you need to underline it. Maybe you need to highlight it. Maybe you need to put a star next to it. While I was an enemy, through the blood of Christ, through his Son, I was reconciled to God.